Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ajaz Haider. Coronavirus continues to devastate. Daily air traffic is down some 80% from its peak in 2019. In recent comments to a U.S. network, NBC, Boeing CEO David Calhoun has predicted the industry will likely struggle for the next 3 to 5 years. But the pathogen is not the only Boeing problem. It is facing multiple civil and criminal lawsuits because of two deadly crashes of its 737 MAX aircraft. The company had to ground its MAX fleet after investigators determined that the crashes were caused by a faulty flight control system which would not allow pilots to attempt the recovery procedure. The longest ever grounding of a U.S. airliner was estimated to cost Boeing $18.6 billion by March 2020. By last month, airlines and lessors had cancelled nearly 200 orders for the MAX. Adding to Boeing's woes is COVID-19 that has brought airport activity to near zero. Boeing's competitor Airbus is also going through the same pain, though it is in better shape than Boeing. Airbus ended the year 2019 on a high. The European commercial airplane manufacturer delivered 863 airplanes for the year in comparison to its larger rival Boeing, which could only manage 345 deliveries. Airbus has also done extremely well over recent years with its popular A320 family of jets, as Boeing struggles with the MAX. As lockdowns relax and domestic air travel picks up, A320 is likely to be the airplane of choice for aviation companies. But while the top dogs struggle to restructure and rely on defense contracts, airlines are teetering on the brink. Most already work on thin margins. The planes they have bought or leased are not flying. Entertainment, hoteling, tourism are the other sectors that have been impacted badly and are unlikely to bounce back anytime soon. Scientists are already talking about the second wave, which could likely be deadlier. What exactly are we looking at? Professionals and experts are already conferencing from the safety of their studies. Seminars have become webinars. Are we looking at a move from jet travel to remote digital connectivity with much less cost? Would people need to travel if they can be connected and perform the same functions sitting before their laptops? We've already seen the impact on oil. On the plus side, the air quality indices in major urban centers have improved because of less vehicular and other fossil fuel traffic. Are there lessons here? To discuss this, we have with us Professor Steve Keen, who is an economist and author of Debunking Economics. We also have with us Seth Kaplan, who is a transportation analyst for the National Public Radio program Here and Now, and has a long stint in journalism. And we shall shortly also be joined by Alex Kerr, who deals with historical and natural tourism. But let me welcome Seth Kaplan and Professor Steve Keen. And since I began with the woes of the airplane manufacturers, let's get to Seth first. Seth, what are we looking at? As I said, Boeing already had the problem with the 737 MAX. Now, of course, there's a COVID-19 problem. How are they going to restructure? And I mean, they don't really want the government money because they don't want the government to have stakes in the company. So what exactly are they planning to do?
Yeah, incredible to think that they were in the kind of shape going into that first crisis that they could somehow still exist, right? After what they went through with the MAX, which seemed like the worst thing imaginable, and now this is so much worse. They're slowing production. I mean, that's part of it. They're trying to bring supply back in line with demand. Demand for their aircraft, of course, much lower now that demand for air travel is much lower. But a lot of this is going to depend on questions bigger than the airline industry itself. It's going to depend on the course of the pandemic. When, for example, is there a vaccine that's widely available? And until that happens, it's really difficult to say. You mentioned Boeing CEO saying it could be a difficult 3 to 5 years. Again, let's see what happens here with the pandemic. But almost nobody expects next year, 2021, to be anything like 2019. And yet airlines and these airframe manufacturers had made all their plans counting on the passenger demand and the revenue from 2019 and in fact a bit more.
Okay, so I'm assuming that when they plan next 5 to 10 years, and those are based on projections of certain years, and then they project, and then obviously they're probably going to take into account a certain percentage of hike in passenger, registration and the rest of it. So if they have done that, and now suddenly this diminuendo, then obviously all the plans have gone awry, which is where I want to find out that, these Airbus or Boeing, they're giants, but even giants can take a fall. And how long do you think it will be unless there is, and you talked about a vaccine, and I've been speaking with experts on my program, and there are two things. One is that no one is really expecting a vaccine to be commercially available until at least the mid of next year. And secondly, given the virulence of this virus, most doctors and immunologists are not sure how effective it will be. So let's keep that in mind and then look at the picture.
And that's exactly the concern. It's not as though that's the last step to getting things back to some semblance of normal. It's the first step, as you said, right? First, you have to have a vaccine, and then we'll see how effective it is. You'll have to have health officials telling people that it's okay for some of us, maybe not all of us, to begin traveling again, right? Because you have the personal angle, right? Do I feel safe traveling for me if I'm of an age and a health condition overall where I feel like I'm not in the highest risk category? But then, what about everybody around me? What about my family who I'm going to visit somewhere else? What I might be carrying from where I live to where they are, and all of those kinds of things, not to mention all of the financial stress of this for lots of people, right? We're in a deep global recession right now. So there are people who even if they want to travel, they just don't have the money to do it. So there are many layers to this. And you're right, airlines and everybody in the industry makes their plans in advance. And look, they know that a slowdown is going to come at some point. They factor that into their plans, just a typical cycle of a recession and then recovery, but nobody was factoring in anything like this. So everybody believed that, sure, sometime here in the next few years, there could have been a downturn, but this is something that was just completely not in the plans of any of these companies. And yeah, the problem is, as you said, they've paid for the airplanes and they've paid for so many of the costs, regardless of whether the revenue comes in. And the problem for Boeing, especially here, is because they had failed to meet so many of their terms of their contracts with the MAX deliveries that it gives the airlines the ability to renegotiate things with them. And so those MAXs, for example, that Boeing thought it was going to get paid a certain amount of money for, these airlines all have the right now to back out of those contracts. In some cases, they might still take the MAXs, but on very different terms, paying a lot less than what Boeing planned for them to pay.
Absolutely. I have some other questions also. Let me hop over to Professor Steve Keen. Professor Keen, of course, what we are witnessing here can be assailed from various angles. We just talked about the aviation industry. There's, of course, the entertainment industry, tourism, hoteling, and yet there is the umbrella issue of how we have economically configured the world over the last, let's say, at least 50 years, if not 100 years. We have spoken about this before also on this program. But since other things have happened, things are unfolding, give me your sense of how you look at what we can retain from the lockdowns that we have seen. As I said in my opening, do we need to necessarily take air travel for conferences, move from one place to another place when we have seen that we could do more or less the same kind of thing sitting at home? How are we going to reshape the way we live?
As of travel, I think the days of regular travels for conferences and for companies managing widely distributed production chains may well be over. Because we have the wing and the prayer, if you'll pardon the pun, of the development of a virus, a vaccine for this virus. And I know people working in that area, and I know that it's possible to produce vaccines very, very rapidly that don't have the health dangers of the mass-produced vaccines. But it is still highly unlikely that we'll have that anything before the next 1 or 2 years. And given the danger that this sort of thing will happen again, because of the pressure we're putting on the planet. The people who've been locked away from that sort of travel for 1 or 2 years might be saying, well, let's find another effective alternative. Now, I can talk from my own experience. Zoom is not it. But things like virtual reality, web interfaces, virtual reality desktops were starting to be developed already before the virus hit. I think that they're going to have a dramatic growth from now on as people try to replicate as much as they can the face-to-face experience you have when you do travel for business and for academic reasons. And that may well cut in half the amount of travel that currently occurs or did occur before the coronavirus for business management and for academic discourse.
Okay. Now, until this pandemic, people have been talking about ecological dysfunction. People have been talking about climate. Lots of governments, including Trump's administration, are not particularly keen on this. And everyone thought that these so-called idealist tree huggers and people who talk about ecology and the rest of it are those somehow they're alarmists or something. But it seems now that nature has a way of trying to restore the balance. And that means that if we go for unsustainable development, then nature is going to hit back. It's going to counter it. And it can counter it in many ways. Now, is that something that has sunk in, do you think, and will contribute to a better understanding of how we need to move towards sustainable development?
Needs to sink in. I think certainly people have been hit very hard in their philosophical attitudes about the relationship between humanity and the planet by the coronavirus. And it's also upending our attitudes about what's the best economic system. The previous pro-globalization, pro-free trade, pro-market deregulation ideology is totally useless in the face of a virus like this. A state-controlled system is far more effective, as we're seeing by the performance of particularly South Asian countries in this crisis, and indeed China. So I think it is sinking in, but it's happening very, very late. And I blame my own profession here because economists, in particular William Nordhaus, and the people around him who are part of the IPC, such as a person called Richard Toll, who was the lead author from 2014, they have deliberately downplayed the dangers of climate change and made people who warn about the dangers appear to be tree huggers for everybody else. The people who first warned about this were engineers, people like Jay Forrester, who developed the limits to growth technology. And they said, if you continue stressing a biological system of which we are part, as we are doing, then it will break down. And when it breaks down, the economy, which is embedded inside that biological system, will itself start to fail. Now we're starting to see this. And I think we're realizing that we should have taken notice of those warnings 50 years ago, not from tree huggers, but from engineers, one of whom actually designed the mathematics of the turrets on American warships. That's no tree hugger.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important point. Thank you so much. That was Professor Steve Keen speaking with us. Let me go back to Seth here. Seth, so we talked about the giant manufacturers, but these manufacturers are producing airplanes and supplying them to hundreds of airlines in the world. Some are big airlines, some are smaller airlines, including budget airlines. Now, you, Boeing, I've got planes from you. I'm not flying them anywhere. I mean, they're just sitting there. So I'm not making any money out of this. I'm not paying you back. And so there's a sort of, cascading effect of, shall I say, business inertia, throughout the chain. So when I talked about the Boeing CEO and what he said, do you think he's factoring in all of this and talking about how the industry is going to be impacted?
I think he is, and I think he understands that what's different about this from a typical situation where you have a struggling airline customer from the perspective of a company like Boeing, is that because everybody's struggling, they're all in the position to use leverage that they don't typically have. There was the CEO of a rather small U.S. airline who recently said, I tell these lessors who lease the airline the planes, if we can't pay our bills, and if you want your airplane, you can come get it. In other words, come repossess it. He says, but they don't want it. So the point is that everybody's saying, look, what are you going to do with the asset? And so the airlines are able to shift some of the pain from themselves onto those suppliers who, at a different moment in time, if an airline was struggling individually, like any of these airlines, whoever has the right to do so would, yes, come repossess the plane and go remarket it somewhere else. That's what's happened over the years. And that was one of the flaws in the forecasts of a lot of these companies. I mean, again, maybe you can't blame anybody for failing to foresee what's going on now, because it's on such a scale that had never happened before. But, Boeing and Airbus would both say, when people would ask them in recent years, but what about if there are some order cancellations, for example? How can you be so bullish on the number of aircraft that are demanded in the world? They would say, well, sure, there might be a problem in one part of the world, but then demand will pick up somewhere else. One airline might have trouble, another airline will take the airplanes instead. Sure, we always overbook. Take orders for some extra airplanes that we know won't be delivered, but it all works out. But right now, everybody is in exactly the same situation, which actually gives them the ability to shift some of the pain onto their suppliers.
Absolutely. I think that's what is happening. Thank you so much. That was Seth Kaplan speaking with us. I'm also joined by Alex Kerr, who is an analyst in historical and national tourism. Mr. Kerr, thank you for being on the program. You're talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the aviation industry and, of course, the knock-off effects. It's tourism, entertainment, hoteling, and the rest of it. How do you look at the situation? I mean, this is something which is likely to have a far-reaching effect on tourism. I mean, I was reading some figures with reference to Italy, and they're losing a lot of money, and it's the same in other parts of the world where countries rely a lot on tourism for foreign exchange.
Yes, well, it's a complex issue because just a few months ago we were all talking about over-tourism.
Absolutely.
And about the damage caused by, the damage to environment and heritage and so on by too many people. So now we've switched to the other side. My sense is that it will take a long time for tourism to revive, but this is actually a good moment for us to think about the problems that we did have with over-tourism. It's not like they magically went away. Those problems are still there. As when tourism comes back. So this is a chance to set in the management techniques that we're going to need in Italy and in Japan, where I'm active.
Yeah, absolutely. So are these structural problems? Because when you say that these problems are not going to automatically go away, that means these are structural problems and they need to be addressed, quite apart from the COVID-19 effect and all that.
COVID-19 is, an act of God, really, and we'll just have to deal with it. The question is that the content of tourism, how do we manage it? For example, access, transportation, signage, overcapacity at famous sites like Zen temples in Kyoto that were always traditionally meditative spaces and now have become, tourist frenzy Instagram spots. That's a damage to the culture, but it can be managed by limiting access, internet reservations. There are many techniques to handle this.
But Mr. Kerr, I perfectly hear you here. But let me say, for instance, Italy's Tourism Association, one of their top officials, estimates that the industry as a whole is worth 200 billion euros a year and provides an important knock-on effect for other sectors. Now, that's a lot of money. Now, while I completely agree with you that there needs to be some kind of, sense of sustainable tourism, shall I say, the fact is that if it's generating big money, it's going to be difficult for countries to actually work that. And my own sense is, I may be entirely wrong, that the hit that they are going to take for whatever 6 months or to a year in tourism because of this pathogen, they're probably going to, once this thing is over, they probably want more and more tourists to come to somehow offset the losses that they've had in the COVID-19 year.
Well, that's exactly what will happen. I, of course, am completely in favor of tourism as an industry. It's important. It's, for example, my activities in Japan are in very small villages, which are dying, and the only hope for them is tourism. That their survival depends upon it. So tourism is beneficial to the world fundamentally, but like any industry, it has minuses that we need to think about. Now, my concern is that in the rush to return to normalcy, to get the tourists back, to get up and going again, that we'll forget about what those issues are. The fact is that tourism is important, and the huge, really collapse of tourism that we've seen in these few months is a calamity. And it's not only economic, it's social, it's cultural, it's a disaster. So there's no question that we want the tourists back. It's just when they do come back, let's manage it better.
So when you say that we need to manage this, and I agree that it's important for local economies, it's important in many other respects also. But when you say that we have to manage it, are you saying that the host states need to enact and enforce laws that somehow limit the number of tourists that come to a particular place? Or are you talking about laws that say, well, some of these places will have very little, ingress by the tourists because they're cultural heritages, and so we need to preserve them. What kind of blueprint for this management are you thinking about?
Actually, mostly not talking about laws, because usually it's not up to the central government or even up to municipalities. It's often up to the museum or up to the temple or up to the garden or whatever to say, okay, our daily limit is whatever, or we have a internet reservation system. It's also up to the travel business. For example, you can see everywhere advertisements for Kyoto's famous gold pavilion. Well, you don't never need to advertise for that again because the whole world is going to go there anyway. But you really could advertise more for the places people haven't gone, such as my villages or other places like that. In other words, how it's functionally distributed. All of that is stuff that we can be thinking about.
Okay, I get your point. Thank you so much. That was speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the horrific attacks in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While the world deals with the coronavirus threat, violence continues to ravage Afghanistan. First, a suicide attack on a funeral in Nangarhar, which killed 32 people, and then an even more brutal attack on a small hospital in the southwestern corner of Kabul. The second attack targeting the maternity ward of the hospital left 24 dead, including 16 women and 2 newborn babies. IS Khorasan, a Daesh affiliate, has claimed responsibility for the funeral attack, while its hand is suspected in the hospital attack. A day earlier, the group had also claimed responsibility for back-to-back blasts that targeted a security convoy in Kabul. The statement said the target was a high-ranking Afghan intelligence officials. These attacks come on the heels of proactive counter-terrorism operations last week, which netted 3 senior IS Khorasan leaders, including the group's leader Ziaul Haq, also known as Abu Umar Khorasani. Last month, a series of raids in Afghanistan's capital, Kabul, helped in capturing another key IS Khorasan leader, Abdullah Orakzai, and 19 associates. Experts believe the recent attacks are reprisals for the CT ops by Afghan intelligence and security forces. American officials say that while the group has been reduced to some pockets and its fighting strength has been halved, it remains resilient and is a major security concern. To discuss the situation further, we have with us Dr. Jonathan Shorden, who's a Program Director and Special Ops Research Coordinator. Rahimullah Yousafzai, who is the resident editor of the news in Peshawar. Thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Dr. Shorden here. Dr. Shorden, give me a reading of this. I mean, even in terms of brutality by the Afghan standards, this particular attack on the maternity ward seems to be extremely horrific and very cowardly.
Yeah, it is brutal to almost be beyond words to describe how bad it is, to the point to where it has garnered quite a bit of international attention, even in an environment, where the news is pretty much consistently focused on the coronavirus and its impacts and those types of things. It seems pretty clear that whoever was behind the attack, and the Taliban have outright denied that they were behind it. ISIS has not claimed it, although, as you say, there is a lot of suspicion that ISIS Khorasan was behind the attack, and it certainly fits the parameters of the types of high-profile attacks that they like to conduct. But whoever was behind this attack clearly meant for it to be of such a horrendous nature, to grab headlines, to spark outrage, and ultimately to result in, I think, what has come about, which is the Afghan government has now announced that its security forces will go back on the offensive. In fact, they did so today, beginning to conduct offensive operations around the country again, which, is a step backwards when it comes to the peace process. The U.S. and others have been calling for reductions in violence for some time, trying to pressure the Taliban to do so. The Taliban chose not to do that, to escalate violence on their side. Now the Afghan government is responding to this horrific attack by going back on the offensive. And so it seems clear that whoever was behind this attack did it both out of a deep hatred of human life in Afghanistan, but also in a very calculated way to try and disrupt and spoil the peace process.
Absolutely. That's a very important point, and I'll come back to you, Jonathan, on that point. But let me go to Rahimullah Yousafzai. Rahimullah Saab, what do you think of this? This seems like the kind of atrocity that we witnessed in the Army public school attack, where we lost 140, including 132 school children. What do you think of this?
I think it's not the first time that a hospital has been attacked, but this was actually a maternity hospital, and women and newborn babies have been killed and injured. This is truly brutal, and I'm not surprised because if the IS is involved, they have done such things in the past also. They blew up 10 local elders near Jalalabad in Nangarhar province. They were made to sit on explosives, and then they were blown up. So these kind of things they have been doing. But I think that, the point which is very important is that this took place in Dashte-Barchi area of Kabul, in western Kabul. And this is an area populated by the Hazara Shia community. And they have been under attack by all these terrorist groups. In Kabul, in Herat, elsewhere, the IS has claimed responsibility earlier for attacks on the Hazara Shias. But I am surprised by the strength of the IS. Just a few weeks ago, Ashraf Ghani had declared that the IS has been defeated, mostly in Nangarhar province, eastern Afghanistan. So that's very intriguing that they still have that kind of strength, that they can launch two attacks in one day in two different cities and cause so much of damage. That's one thing. But I think that, Ashraf Ghani, by announcing and ordering his forces to resume operations against Taliban and other groups, as he said this actually, it won't lead to anything. there will be more bloodshed. If the Afghan government carries out operations, the Taliban will also react. So I think this will be something which is futile. And in the end, there has to be some compromise. And that's why if the prisoners release issue is resolved and the inter-Afghan dialogue can begin, the first point the Afghan government, I think, will raise will be a ceasefire. And Taliban would be under pressure because if there's a ceasefire, then the peace talks can move forward.
But what I sense, and I think this where I'll go back to the point that Jonathan was making in terms of this particular activity being calculated to put the peace process under pressure. And here's a statement by Hamdullah Mohib, and he says there seems little point in continuing to engage Taliban in peace talks. Now, despite the fact that the Taliban have said that they've completely denied any kind of involvement, and the Nangarhar attack has already been, the IS Khorasan has taken responsibility for this. But interestingly enough, the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and I think he had a clear sense that this could go that way. He condemned the two attacks, but also noted the Taliban had denied responsibility and said the lack of a peace deal left the country vulnerable to such violence. So, Jonathan, there is a sense that the Afghan government, because it is somehow not wanting to own the process, is trying to conflate the two issues here. One is the IS Khorasan issue, the other is the Taliban issue. And while the Taliban have been attacking the Afghan forces, that's a completely different issue. But now it seems to me that there's a conflation here, and that conflation, I think, is going to redound to the disadvantage of the overall peace process, or could.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I think it really depends. How you read this depends on how strongly you believe that this was that the maternity ward attack was conducted by ISIS, as opposed to some other group, or possibly having been, the Taliban or somehow enabled by the Taliban. There are a lot of people in Kabul just, scrolling through social media, Twitter the past few days to try and get a sense of the mood in Kabul. There are, a lot of Kabulis who are understandably extremely upset by this, and who are blaming the Taliban for it. And some of that is frankly raw emotion, as one could understand. Some of it stems from the arrests that you mentioned earlier last week of the 3 senior ISIS commanders. There appears to have been some nexus in that particular group of individuals with members of the Haqqani network, or at least some indications that the Haqqanis were supporting the safe house that those individuals were arrested in. And as you know, the Haqqani network are part and parcel of the Taliban organization. And so there are linkages that people have been pointing to say that while the Taliban have outright denied this attack, perhaps they enabled it, or perhaps they had a hand in it, etc. The one thing I will say is that regardless of who was behind it, the breakdown of the peace process, the resumption of offensive operations by the Afghan government, which will surely result in increased violence and more attacks on the Taliban side of things as well, really benefits ISIS Khorasan, right? I mean, those types of groups thrive amidst chaos and love to be in the middle of a civil war in which governance breaks down all around them. And so, no matter who is behind this, one of the major benefactors of a resumption to wide-scale fighting and violence in Afghanistan will be ISIS Khorasan.
Absolutely. And, it'll obviously operations against ISIS Khorasan by the Afghan forces, and also the clashes between the Taliban and IS Khorasan. The Taliban will be forced to concentrate in opposition to the Afghan security forces, and the Afghan security forces will be concentrating in opposition to the Taliban. But interestingly, the Pentagon has declined to comment on Ghani's stated intent to restart offensive operations. However, they said that the U.S. military will continue to reserve the right to defend Afghan security forces if they are attacked by the Taliban. So that also pulls in the U.S. military into this. Rahimullah Yousafzai, Do you think, I mean, you have been looking at this situation for more than 3 decades. Do you think, and some of the Taliban attacks were also very brutal, but at this point in time, do you believe that they could have facilitated this attack on the maternity ward, or they could have had any kind of hand in this?
I'm surprised that the two are being linked as if Taliban have enabled the IS to launch this attack in Kabul, or that the Haqqani network actually is working together with the IS. Haqqani network, as we all know, is part and parcel of the Taliban movement. And Sirajuddin Haqqani, the leader of the Haqqani network, is also the deputy leader of the Taliban group. So I don't think that's even possible, because the IS has been posing a threat to Taliban. In the early years, a number of senior Taliban commanders had joined the IS, Daesh, but now I think nobody is joining them. So I don't even, can imagine. I can't imagine that, Taliban would be enabling or supporting the IS, or the Haqqani network will do that. I think the issue is that the Taliban, have denied responsibility for these two attacks. But today there has been one more attack on a courthouse in Gardez, the capital city of Paktia. I'm a bit surprised by this, that Taliban have claimed responsibility for the attack, which I think killed 5 people, because they had given a pledge that they will not launch attacks in urban centers. But Gardez is a city not far from the Pakistani border. And if they have done this, it means that earlier they were saying they have the right to launch attacks in the rural areas. They won't attack the US forces. They won't even attack the Afghan forces in the urban centers. But today they have launched this attack in an urban center, which I think changes the whole equation. It means that if Ashraf Ghani says they're going to resume offensives against Taliban, Taliban have given this message that they will also do this and we will respond to every attack.
Okay, I'm also running out of time, and I'm joined by Hamdullah Hamdard, who's an analyst, joins me from Kabul. Mr. Hamdard, give me your reading of the horrific attack on the maternity ward. And in my opening before you joined, I mentioned the counterterrorism operations by the Afghan intelligence and security forces that netted, 4 leaders of IS Khorasan and also 19 associates of these leaders. So do you think it could be a reprisal for those arrests?
I believe, and I've said this so many times, that the peace deal which was signed between the US and the Taliban was not properly coordinated with the Afghan government. And that's why they faced the obstacles during the implementation of the peace deal. That resulted in this violation, which has started once again in Afghanistan. Taliban or the ISK, they have attacked this. So we witnessed that the Taliban attacked the maternity hospital, which is.
No, are you saying that the Taliban have attacked the maternity hospital?
Well, for the moment, Taliban are denying that, but it doesn't seem so. And they say that ISK has attacked the maternity hospital. But whatever and whoever has attacked that, the ground was paved by the Taliban. The insecurity is created by the Taliban, and Taliban are considered similar criminals as the ones who attacked
I'm just trying to
Taliban
understand.
have to reduce the violence. The government has to reduce the violence.
Mr. Hamdard,
and finally,
Mr. Hamdard, I'm trying to understand this. You're saying that the Taliban have paved this. By all evidence, Taliban have had clashes with IS Khorasan and Nangarhar. Taliban have actually managed to clear lots of IS Khorasan pockets in Kunar. So how do you square that with what you're saying with reference to the Taliban somehow facilitating this?
You know that if Taliban are providing the ground for the ISK, if they are creating the violence in the provinces and anywhere else or even in the capital, then of course the ground is paved for the ISK to attack easily, to target anyone, and nobody recognized ISK as the biggest threat in Afghanistan, but the Taliban are, and Taliban have the ability to attack almost anywhere. So they are the ones who are to be blamed by the nation here in Afghanistan. People are blaming them. ISK's attacks are also almost considered as planned by the Taliban.
Rahimullah Yousafzai, what do you think of this?
I think this point has also been raised by President Ashraf Ghani and the NSA, Hamdullah Mohib and others. They say if Taliban were to stop violence, reduce violence, then they say that the ISK, can be tackled. But I actually, this linkage between Taliban and ISK, there's no evidence yet of that. We have evidence that they have fought each other. We have evidence that Taliban were able to clear the ISK from northern Afghanistan, from Zabul, from Kunar, from Nangarhar. They also played a role along with the Afghan government and the U.S. airstrikes. But I think that there is no meeting point. There is no common, point that Taliban will
let me get the reading of Jonathan Snowden also.
Together. I think that's not really, there's no evidence for that yet.
Okay. Jonathan, very quickly before I wrap up, what do you think? I mean, let's go back to what you were saying about this vitiating the atmosphere, and it could be a calculated move because it brings the peace process under pressure. This seems to be leading towards that.
Yeah, I mean, to the points raised by the other commentators, I would just say that it's easy to try and conflate the two, given the frustration that Afghans have with the level of violence and insecurity in Afghanistan, and that's completely understandable. And ISIS definitely does benefit from that type of atmosphere. But I will say it's a sad fact that if someone is depraved enough to want to go into a hospital and shoot up a bunch of mothers and newborns, that it is extremely difficult to stop that type of attack, even if there were no insecurity, et cetera. I mean, I could point to, many events that occur inside the United States, which is generally a very secure country, in which individuals have gone into, schools and killed children, et cetera, places of worship and killed people there. These attacks are just extremely difficult to stop if you have one individual with weapons who is depraved enough to try and do those things. And so, again, I would just say it's very, very difficult to stop these types of attacks, no matter what the situation is.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Jonathan Snowden. Thank you, Rahimullah Yousafzai. Thank you, Hamdullah Hamdard. This is all from Indus Special for tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. For latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.